The people of Willow Creek always said Margaret Holloway was too much of everything, too large, too stubborn, too different. They said it quietly when she passed through the market, and they said it loudly when they thought she was too far away to hear. But what they never understood was that Margaret had spent her whole life carrying things heavier than the weight they saw on the outside. For years, the little frontier town had taken everything she gave while pretending she had nothing worth giving. They lined up outside her bakery before sunrise for her warm bread, sweet pies, and cinnamon rolls, but many of the same people who carried her food home were the first to laugh when she walked down the street. They loved what her hands created, but they refused to see the woman behind those hands. Margaret Holloway knew every whisper in Willow Creek. She knew every cruel smile, every fake compliment, and every person who looked at her as if she was something to be tolerated instead of someone to be respected. Yet every morning, before the first light touched the dusty roads, she unlocked the bakery door, tied her apron, and began another day. Because Margaret had learned something long ago. The world could decide what it wanted to think about her, but it could never decide who she was. The bakery was the one place where she felt like herself. The smell of fresh bread filling the room, the warmth of the ovens against the cold mountain air, and the quiet rhythm of kneading dough gave her a peace she could not find anywhere else. In that small building on the corner of Willow Creek's Main Street, Margaret was not the woman people laughed about. She was a creator, a provider, a woman who had built something with her own hands. But in a town where appearances mattered more than kindness, that was not enough for some people. Margaret, are you planning on feeding the whole county? Or are you finally going to admit you enjoy making enough food for yourself? The voice belonged to Thomas Bell, the owner of the local supply store. He stood outside the bakery with two other men, laughing as if he had delivered the funniest joke in the territory. Margaret stood behind the counter holding a tray of fresh rolls. She heard the laughter, felt the familiar sting, and for a brief moment, the old sadness returned. Years ago, those words would have ruined her entire day. Now she simply looked at Thomas and placed the tray down. "People seem to enjoy buying my food, Mr. Bell," she said calmly. "Perhaps that means I know what I am doing." The men laughed again, but this time there was something different in Margaret's voice. She was not begging for approval. She was not trying to make herself smaller. Thomas noticed it too. He stopped smiling for half a second before walking away. Margaret watched them leave through the window. Then she turned back toward the bakery and continued working. She had survived worse than a few careless words. What she did not know was that her life was about to change because someone far away had heard her name. High above Willow Creek, beyond the thick forests and steep mountain paths, lived a man named Caleb Ror. Most people in town knew very little about him. They knew he was a mountain cowboy who owned a small piece of land near the northern ridge. They knew he was quiet, rarely visited town, and preferred the company of horses and open skies over crowded rooms filled with people. Some called him lonely, some called him strange, some said he was running from something. The truth was much simpler. Caleb had spent years learning that silence hurt less than disappointment. After losing the people closest to him, he built a life where nobody could leave because nobody was allowed close enough to matter. His ranch was small but strong, built from rough wood and endless patience. His horses trusted him, the mountains knew him, the wind knew his name. People did not, and Caleb had convinced himself that was enough. But as another harsh winter approached, even he had to admit the quiet had become too heavy. One evening, sitting beside the fire in his cabin, Caleb stared at the empty chair across from him. He imagined what it would be like to have someone waiting there, someone to talk to after a long day, someone who cared whether he returned home safely. The thought disappeared quickly, replaced by the familiar belief that some people were simply meant to walk alone. Then came the letter, a request for marriage. It arrived through a traveling messenger who claimed there was a woman willing to come west and build a life with him. Caleb was confused. He had never written such a request. He had never asked anyone to come, but the letter carried details about him. Details that made it seem real. The name attached to it was Margaret Holloway. He knew the name. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Margaret. The baker. The woman people talked about when they thought kindness was not required. Caleb wondered why someone would send him a letter about a woman he had never met. He did not know that the same people who sent that letter had another plan entirely. In Willow Creek, several powerful men had been watching Caleb's land for years. His property sat along a route that would become valuable if the new railroad expansion reached the region. The land that Caleb refused to sell could make certain people very wealthy. Mayor Edwin Voss had tried everything. He offered money, he offered deals, he offered promises. Caleb refused every time, so the mayor decided to attack something Caleb did not protect with a rifle: his heart. The plan was simple. Send a woman Caleb would supposedly reject. Make sure the entire town knew about it. When Caleb turned her away, Margaret would be humiliated, Caleb would be blamed, and the town would have the perfect excuse to push him out. They believed they were creating a joke. They did not realize they were creating something they could not control. When Margaret received the marriage request, she stared at the letter for a long time. Nobody had ever written her words like those. The letter spoke of respect. It spoke of wanting a woman with strength. A woman who knew hardship. A woman who could build a home instead of simply decorate one. Margaret read those words again and again. A small part of her wondered if it was a mistake. A larger part of her wondered what it would feel like to finally be chosen. Not because she made the best bread. Not because people needed something from her, but because someone wanted her. That night, Margaret sat alone in her bakery after closing. The candles burned low, while snow tapped gently against the windows. She looked around the room she had spent years building. It was safe. It was familiar, but it was also lonely. Maybe everyone deserves one chance to start over, she whispered. The next morning, Margaret packed her belongings. The town gathered to watch her leave. Some pretended to be happy for her. Others did not even bother hiding their amusement. Abigail Turner, one of the wealthiest women in Willow Creek, stood near the road with a group of friends. "Well," Abigail said with a smile, "I suppose even Margaret found someone desperate enough." The laughter that followed was quiet, but Margaret heard it. She always heard it. She held her head high anyway. She climbed into the wagon, placed her small trunk beside her, and began the long journey toward Caleb Ror's mountain ranch. She did not know she was traveling toward another broken person. She did not know the man waiting for her had never asked for her. She did not know that when the truth came out, both of their lives would change forever. The mountain road was colder than Margaret expected. The wind cut through her coat, and the trail became more difficult with every mile. Still, she refused to complain. She had spent years proving people wrong. She was not about to stop now. When the wagon finally reached the ranch, the sun was disappearing behind the mountains. Margaret stepped down slowly, holding her bag tightly. The cabin stood ahead of her, surrounded by tall trees and endless wilderness. For the first time in years, she felt nervous. Not because she was afraid of the mountain, because she was afraid of hope. The cabin door opened. A tall man stepped outside. Caleb Ror was exactly what people had described. Quiet, strong, weathered by years of hard work. But his expression changed the moment he saw her. Margaret noticed. That single moment told her everything. The hope she had carried across the mountains began to crack. Caleb looked at the wagon, then at Margaret, then back toward the road. Something was wrong. "Who are you?" he asked. Margaret swallowed. Margaret Holloway. The silence between them felt heavier than the mountain air. Caleb's face tightened. "No." The word was quiet, but it hurt. Margaret looked down. "I was told you sent for me." Caleb stepped closer, confusion replacing surprise. "I never sent for anyone." The world seemed to stop. The wind moved through the trees. The horses shifted behind the wagon. But Margaret heard only those words. She had spent years being laughed at, years being told she was unwanted. And now, After finally believing someone had chosen her, she discovered she had been sent somewhere as another person's joke. Caleb saw the pain cross her face, and something inside him changed. Because in that moment, he realized the same people who had betrayed him had also used her. They had not only tried to hurt him, they had chosen the kindest person they knew and placed her directly in the middle of their cruelty. Margaret slowly reached for her bag. "I understand," she said softly. "Margaret, I will leave." Caleb looked toward the darkening sky. A storm was already forming above the mountains. "You won't make it back tonight. I have survived difficult roads before." "I believe you," Caleb said. "But this mountain does not care how strong someone is." Margaret looked at him. For the first time, she noticed something in his eyes. Not anger, not disgust, pain. "You were not expecting me," she said. "No, and you do not want me here." Caleb opened his mouth, but no answer came, because the truth was complicated. He did not know her. He had not chosen this. But he also knew what it felt like to stand alone while the world decided you were not worth understanding. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come inside until the storm passes." Margaret hesitated. Then she picked up her bag. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because she had nowhere else to go. And neither of them knew that the cruelest plan ever created in Willow Creek was about to become the greatest turning point of their lives. The cabin was warmer than Margaret expected. From the outside, Caleb Ror's home looked exactly like the kind of place people in Willow Creek whispered about. A lonely cabin hidden away from the world, surrounded by towering trees and endless mountain paths. A place where a man could disappear and never be found. But inside, Margaret noticed something different. It was not a cold place. It was simply a quiet one. A large fireplace burned against one wall, filling the room with a soft orange glow. A wooden table sat near the center, carefully built and maintained. Tools were arranged neatly near the doorway. A stack of firewood rested beside the hearth, each piece cut and prepared with patience. Everything had a purpose. Everything had been cared for. The only thing missing was another person. Margaret stood near the entrance, suddenly aware of herself. Her wet boots, her heavy coat, the small trunk she carried, the way she filled more space in a room than other women. She had spent so many years apologizing for existing that the feeling came naturally. "I will not be a burden," she said quietly. Caleb, who was hanging her coat near the door, looked over his shoulder. "What?" Margaret looked down. "I understand this was not what you wanted. I understand I was brought here because someone wanted to make you angry, but I will not stay here and expect you to take care of me." Caleb studied her. There was something about the way she said it that bothered him, not because she was being difficult, because she sounded like someone who had said those words many times before. "I never said you were a burden," he replied. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "You did not have to." The answer hit him harder than he expected. Caleb was a man who understood broken fences, injured horses, and storms that could destroy a roof overnight. But people were different. People carried wounds nobody could see. He looked away and placed another log into the fire.
"My words came out wrong."
Margaret looked surprised. A quiet man admitting he was wrong was not something she saw often, especially not from men like Caleb. "I have not met many people willing to say that," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "Maybe you have been meeting the wrong people." For some reason, that simple sentence made Margaret's chest tighten. Because she knew it was true. The storm outside grew stronger. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, making the windows shake. Caleb walked toward the small kitchen area. "You must be hungry." Margaret immediately shook her head. "I am fine. You traveled all day." "I said I am fine." Caleb stopped. There was something defensive in her voice. Not anger. Protection. He slowly nodded. "All right." The fact that he did not argue surprised her. Most people argued when she said no. They either insisted because they thought they knew better, or they ignored her because they did not care. Caleb simply accepted her answer. After a moment, he opened a cabinet. "I am making stew." I can help. You do not have to. I know. She removed her coat and stepped toward the kitchen. But I want to. For the first time that evening, Caleb saw something different in her. Not the woman the town had described, not the joke they had tried to send him. A woman who had crossed miles of wilderness after being deceived, yet still wanted to contribute. That told him more about her than any letter ever could. They worked quietly together. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. Margaret was used to filling empty spaces with conversation, because empty spaces usually meant judgment was coming. Caleb was used to silence because silence had always been easier. But slowly, something changed. The silence became peaceful. Margaret prepared vegetables while Caleb handled the meat. She noticed how careful he was, despite his rough appearance. His hands were large and scarred, but every movement was controlled. "You cook often?" she asked. "When I have to." She smiled slightly. "That sounds like a man's answer." Caleb looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means you probably burn everything and pretend you meant to." A small sound escaped him. Almost a laugh. Almost. Margaret looked up quickly. For a moment, she thought she imagined it, but there was a slight change in his expression, a little less guarded. "Did you just almost smile?" she asked. "No. You did." "I did not." "You absolutely did." Caleb shook his head, and Margaret realized something strange. She had made him uncomfortable, not because she was unwanted, because she had caught him being human. The realization warmed her more than the fire. Later that night, they sat across from each other at the wooden table. The stew was simple, but Margaret had never tasted anything so meaningful. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, she was eating with someone instead of eating alone. Caleb took a few bites before looking up. "This is good," Margaret smiled. "I know." The confidence in her answer surprised him. Then she laughed softly. "I mean, thank you." Caleb looked down at his bowl. "My mother used to cook." The words came unexpectedly. Margaret became quiet. She must have been good. She was. A pause followed. "She taught me that food is more than survival." Margaret nodded. "It is." Caleb looked at her. "What does it mean to you?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she answered honestly. "It means someone cared enough to make something with their own hands." The room became quiet, because both of them understood that sentence. Caleb understood loneliness. Margaret understood being overlooked. And somewhere between a bowl of stew and a mountain storm, two strangers began to realize they were not as alone as they thought. The next morning, the storm had not stopped. Snow covered the path leading away from the cabin. Margaret stood near the window, watching the white landscape. "I suppose I am trapped here." Caleb walked beside her. "Temporarily." She smiled faintly. "That is a polite way of saying trapped." He looked outside. "The mountain decides when people leave. And you listen?" "I learned not to argue with things stronger than me." Margaret looked at him. "That sounds like wisdom. It sounds like experience." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret noticed a stack of papers on the table. The top page had her name written on it. She looked closer. Caleb noticed immediately. "Do not touch that." His voice was sharper than before. Margaret stepped back. "I apologize." Caleb immediately regretted his tone. "It is not you." She looked at him. "What is it?" Caleb stared at the papers. For years, he had avoided thinking about the people who wanted his land. But now Margaret was involved. She deserved the truth. "Those people in Willow Creek did not send you here just to embarrass me." Margaret slowly turned. "What do you mean?" Caleb picked up the papers. "They have been trying to take my land for years." Margaret listened carefully. "Why?" "Railroad expansion. My property sits along a route they want." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And they thought sending me here would help them." Caleb nodded. "They thought I would lose my temper. They thought I would throw you out. They thought everyone would see me as a dangerous man who could not control himself." Margaret was silent, because suddenly, everything made sense. The laughter when she left, the way people watched her, the way they seemed certain she would fail. They had not only used her feelings, they had planned for her humiliation. "They knew exactly what they were doing," she whispered. Caleb looked at her. "Yes, Margaret walked toward the table. For years, people had underestimated her because they thought kindness meant weakness. They thought because she stayed quiet, she did not notice. But Margaret noticed everything. Every conversation held in the corner of her bakery. Every secret spoken near the ovens because people assumed she was too harmless to matter. She remembered names, dates, words. And now, for the first time, those memories had a purpose. They made one mistake, she said. Caleb watched her. What mistake? Margaret looked up. They forgot I was there. A slow understanding crossed Caleb's face, because he suddenly realized something. The town had spent years ignoring Margaret Holloway, and sometimes the person everyone ignored was the person who saw the most. Outside, the storm continued to bury the mountain roads, but inside the small cabin, something much stronger than a storm was beginning. A partnership, a truth waiting to be uncovered. And a quiet baker who had spent her whole life being told she was insignificant was about to show an entire town exactly how wrong they had been. For the next several days, Margaret and Caleb remained surrounded by snow. The mountain had made its decision, and neither of them had a choice but to accept it. At first, Margaret worried that every passing hour would make things more uncomfortable. She had entered Caleb's home without an invitation, without knowing him, and without knowing what would happen when the roads finally opened. She expected distance. She expected coldness. She expected the same rejection she had experienced her entire life. But Caleb Ror was not like the people of Willow Creek. He did not pretend to care while secretly laughing behind her back. He did not offer false kindness with hidden intentions. If he was quiet, it was because he was quiet. If he was upset, he said so. If he respected something, he showed it. And strangely enough, that honesty made Margaret feel safer than all the empty compliments she had received before. Every morning, Caleb woke before sunrise. Margaret noticed it on the second day. The man moved through the cabin like someone who had followed the same routine for years. He fed the horses, checked the fences, carried wood inside, and inspected the supplies. He lived with the discipline of someone who knew the wilderness did not forgive carelessness. At first, Margaret watched from the window. Then, on the third morning, she grabbed her coat. Caleb looked over as she walked toward the door. "What are you doing?" "Helping." "You do not have to." "I know." He studied her. Margaret smiled slightly. "You already asked me that." A small silence followed. Then Caleb looked away. "That stubbornness is going to get you into trouble." She adjusted her coat. "I have been told that before." "I believe it." She laughed softly. And Caleb almost smiled again. Almost. Outside, the cold air surrounded them. Margaret expected the work to be impossible. She was not unfamiliar with hard work. Running a bakery required long hours, heavy lifting, and endless patience. But the mountain was different. The mountain demanded everything. The first time she tried carrying a bucket of water across the snow, Caleb immediately reached for it. "I can carry it. I did not say you couldn't. Your hand is already out." He paused. Margaret raised an eyebrow. For the first time, Caleb looked slightly embarrassed. "I was helping." "I know." She took the bucket. "And I appreciate it. But I am not made of glass." Something changed in his expression, because that sentence was familiar, not the words, the feeling behind them. People had always decided what Margaret could and could not do without asking. Caleb understood that more than anyone, so he simply nodded. "All right," and he let her carry it. That small moment meant more to Margaret than he realized, because for most of her life, people had either mocked her strength or ignored it. Nobody had simply trusted her. The days passed slowly. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, a strange comfort began forming. Margaret cleaned, she cooked, she repaired clothing, she organized supplies, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because it was who she was. Caleb noticed everything. He noticed the way she hummed quietly while preparing meals. He noticed the way she carefully folded blankets before sleeping. He noticed how she thanked objects as strange as a well-used cooking pot. because she had always believed things deserved appreciation if they helped someone. Most importantly, he noticed how differently she saw the world. One evening, Caleb entered the cabin after repairing part of the roof. Snow covered his shoulders, and his beard was frozen from the cold. Margaret immediately stood. "Sit down." Caleb looked confused. "What? You are freezing." "I am fine." She gave him a look that reminded him of his own stubbornness. "You say that often." "And it is usually true." "Usually is not always." Caleb sat. Margaret brought a warm cloth and placed it near the fire. "You know," she said, "for someone who lives alone, you are not very good at taking care of yourself." Caleb looked at her. "I have survived." Surviving is not the same as living. The words stayed with him, because they were simple, but they were true. For years, Caleb had believed survival was enough. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. He had convinced himself that needing nothing meant being strong. But Margaret was beginning to show him something different. Maybe strength was not about needing nobody. Maybe strength was allowing someone to matter. "Why did you agree to come?" Caleb suddenly asked. Margaret stopped. She looked at the fire. For a moment, the confident woman disappeared, and he saw the person underneath, the woman who had carried years of pain quietly. "I thought someone finally saw me." The answer was so honest that Caleb did not know what to say. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I know how foolish that sounds." "It does not." "It does." "No." She looked at him. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "It does not sound foolish." Her eyes became glossy. Because nobody had ever defended that hope before. People had laughed at her for believing someone could want her. They had treated her happiness like something ridiculous. But Caleb did not. He understood. "I spent most of my life being the person people noticed only when they needed something," Margaret said softly. She swallowed. "They came to my bakery when they wanted bread. They came when they wanted cakes for celebrations. They came when they wanted something warm on a cold morning." Her voice lowered. "But nobody ever came because they wanted me." Caleb looked away. The pain in her words was difficult to hear, not because he pitied her, because he recognized it. "I know what that feels like," he said. Margaret looked at him. Caleb stared into the fire. "People think being alone means nobody is around." He paused. "Sometimes being alone means people are around you every day, but nobody really sees you." The cabin became silent, a silence filled with understanding. For the first time, Margaret realized Caleb was not just a lonely mountain cowboy. He was a man who had been hiding from the same feelings she had been carrying. Not being wanted, not being chosen, not being seen. The storm outside continued, but the space between them became warmer. The next morning, Margaret woke early. Something felt different. She could not explain it. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the fact that she no longer felt like a guest waiting to leave. She walked into the kitchen and found Caleb already there. He placed a cup of coffee on the table. For her, Margaret stopped. "You made this?" Caleb nodded. "I figured you were tired." She looked at the cup, then at him. A simple cup of coffee. That was all. But somehow, it felt enormous. "Thank you." Caleb shrugged. "It was only coffee." Margaret smiled. "No." She held the cup carefully. "It was someone thinking about me." Caleb did not answer, but he understood. Later that afternoon, while organizing the supplies in the cabin, Margaret found an old wooden box tucked beneath a shelf. She did not open it. She simply noticed the name carved into the side. Ror. When Caleb saw her looking at it, his expression changed. Not anger, sadness. "That belonged to my father." Margaret stepped away. "I am sorry. I should not have looked." "You didn't." A pause. "He left it when he died." Margaret waited. She did not push. She had learned that some wounds needed room before they could be touched. "My father taught me everything about this land," Caleb said quietly. "How to ride, how to hunt, how to survive." He looked at the box. "But he also taught me something else." "What?" "That people leave." Margaret's heart tightened. "Caleb? He believed caring about something gave it the power to hurt you." The sadness in his voice was almost hidden. Almost. And you believed him. For a long time. Margaret looked around the cabin, at the empty chair, the quiet walls, the life Caleb had built around himself. Maybe he was wrong. Caleb looked at her. Maybe. It was not a big answer, but for Caleb, it was, because he was allowing the possibility that maybe loneliness was not safety. Maybe it was just another kind of prison. That evening, Margaret discovered something unexpected. A stack of old papers hidden beneath Caleb's desk. Land documents, letters, records. She was not trying to search through his things, but one name caught her attention. Edwin Voss, the mayor. She looked closer. The dates went back years. Payments, requests, offers. And suddenly, Margaret understood. The mayor had not recently become interested in Caleb's land. This had been planned for a long time. Caleb. Something in her voice made him turn. What? She pointed to the papers. He walked over. His expression changed as he read them. I did not know these existed. Margaret looked carefully. Someone wanted you to believe you had no options. Caleb frowned. What do you mean? She touched the papers gently. They were not just trying to make you leave. She looked up. They were trying to make you feel alone enough to give up. Caleb stared at her, and in that moment, he saw something he had not expected. Margaret Holloway was not just kind. She was observant, sharp, intelligent. The same people who mocked her for years had mistaken silence for ignorance. They had forgotten something important. The person standing quietly in the corner was often the one who noticed everything. Caleb slowly smiled. This time, he did not hide it. You really do see things others miss. Margaret looked surprised. Is that a compliment? Yes, she smiled. That is rare from you. Caleb nodded. Then remember it. The words were simple, but Margaret carried them with her, because for the first time in years, someone was not asking her to prove she mattered. Someone already knew, and far away in Willow Creek, the people who had created their cruel little plan had no idea that the two people they underestimated were becoming stronger together. The discovery changed something between Margaret and Caleb. Not everything, not all at once. Two people who had spent years protecting themselves did not suddenly forget their fears overnight. They did not wake up the next morning as if the pain they carried had never existed. But something important had happened. They had started trusting each other. And trust, Margaret knew, was not built through grand promises. It was built through small moments. A cup of coffee waiting on the table. A door held open during a storm. A person listening when you finally found the courage to speak. For the first time in many years, Margaret Holloway felt like she was not walking through life alone. But as the snow slowly began to melt around Caleb's mountain home, the truth waiting below the surface began to rise with it. And that truth was far more dangerous than either of them expected. 3 weeks after the storm began, the weather finally softened. The heavy snow that had trapped them started breaking apart. Water flowed down the mountain slopes, creating small streams that cut through the frozen ground. The world outside was waking up again. Margaret stood on the porch one morning, holding a cup of coffee, watching sunlight touch the peaks. She had never seen anything like it. Willow Creek had always been the place she knew. The streets, the bakery, the familiar faces. But this mountain was different. It was wild, honest. There was no pretending here. The mountain did not care what someone looked like. It did not care who had money or who had influence. It only cared whether you were prepared. Margaret found something comforting about that. You like it. Caleb's voice came from behind her. She turned. He stood, holding a basket of supplies, his dark hair slightly messy from the morning wind. Like what? The mountain. Margaret looked back toward the view. I think I do. Caleb nodded. Most people don't. Most people never give things a chance. The answer made him look at her, because Margaret was no longer talking only about the mountain. She was talking about herself. For years, people in Willow Creek had decided who she was before knowing her. They saw her size. They saw her quiet nature. They saw what they wanted to see. But Caleb had looked closer. And because of that, Margaret had started seeing herself differently too. "Margaret!" She turned. "Yes?" Her Caleb hesitated. It was unusual for him. He was a man who could face dangerous weather, angry animals, and difficult situations without fear. But talking about feelings seemed to make him uncertain. "I owe you an apology." Her expression softened. "For what?" "For how I reacted when you arrived." Margaret looked down. "You were surprised." "I was." He paused. "But I saw the hurt on your face, and I knew I had added to something you had already carried for years." She was quiet, because he was right. The first few minutes at the cabin had hurt, not because Caleb had done something cruel, but because his reaction reminded her of every other person who had looked at her and decided she was not enough. "I understand," she said softly. "No." Caleb shook his head. "You forgive people too easily." Margaret looked at him. "Is that a bad thing?" "Sometimes." She smiled a little. "Maybe." Caleb stepped closer. "But I want you to know something." She waited. "When I saw you standing there that day, I did not see a problem." Margaret's breath caught slightly. "I saw someone who had been wronged." The words were simple, but they meant everything. Because for years, people had made her feel like she was the problem, like her existence created inconvenience, like she needed to apologize for being exactly who she was. Caleb did the opposite. He separated her from the cruelty others had placed on her. "You are different than they said you were," he added. Margaret smiled faintly. "What did they say?" Caleb looked away. "They said you were difficult." She laughed quietly. "That is not completely untrue." He looked back at her. "They said you were weak." The smile disappeared. "That is not true." Margaret looked at him, and for some reason, hearing him say it mattered. "They said you would not last a week out here." Caleb glanced toward the cabin. "You have lasted longer than most men I know." Margaret laughed. "Are you saying I am tougher than you?" "I am saying I would not want to argue with you." That made her laugh harder, and Caleb realized something. He liked hearing that sound, more than he expected. The quiet cowboy who had spent years avoiding attachment found himself waiting for moments like this, waiting to hear Margaret laugh, waiting to see her smile, waiting to hear what she thought. It frightened him, not because it felt wrong, because it felt right. Later that afternoon, they began repairing the small garden area beside the cabin. Margaret knelt beside the soil, carefully planting seeds. Caleb watched from nearby. "You know what you're doing. My mother taught me." "She taught you baking too, and gardening." Margaret smiled. "She said a person should always know how to create something." Caleb leaned on the fence. "She sounds wise." She was. A quiet sadness crossed Margaret's face. "She was the first person who told me I was beautiful." Caleb looked at her. Margaret continued planting. "After she died, I think I forgot how to believe that." The confession was quiet, almost lost beneath the wind, but Caleb heard it, and he felt something heavy in his chest, because he knew what it was like to lose the person who made you feel important. "My mother was the same." Margaret looked up. "Really?" Caleb nodded. "She used to say the world would try to tell you what you were worth." He looked toward the mountains. "But she said the world was usually wrong." Margaret smiled. "Your mother sounds wise too." She was. For a while they worked without speaking. And somehow, the silence felt comfortable. Not empty, comfortable. That evening, they found something unexpected near the edge of the property. A piece of paper caught between two rocks. At first, Caleb thought it was trash. Then he saw the writing. His expression changed. Margaret noticed immediately. "What is it?" Caleb unfolded the paper. It was a letter, old, but still readable. The name at the bottom made his jaw tighten. Edwin Voss, the mayor. Margaret stepped closer. "What does it say?" Caleb read silently. Then his face hardened. He knew. Knew what? About the railroad route. Margaret frowned. Caleb handed her the paper. She read it carefully. The letter was a conversation between Mayor Voss and someone from a business company. It mentioned Caleb's land. It mentioned forcing him out. And it mentioned Margaret's name. Her heart sank. "They planned this before I ever received the letter." Caleb nodded. This was never about a joke. Margaret folded the paper. No. Her voice became quieter. They used me. Caleb watched her expression. He expected anger. Instead, he saw something else. Determination. A calm, focused strength. They thought I was the easiest person to hurt. Caleb stepped closer. Margaret. She looked at him. But they forgot something. What? She held up the letter. They spent years ignoring me. A small, serious smile appeared. They never noticed I was listening. Caleb stared at her, and for the first time, he saw exactly how dangerous Margaret could be. Not because she carried a weapon, not because she could overpower anyone, because she knew things, she remembered conversations, she understood people, and she had spent years watching from the background while everyone revealed who they truly were. The people of Willow Creek had made a terrible mistake. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They had mistaken silence for ignorance. And they had mistaken Margaret Holloway for someone who could be easily discarded. They were about to learn otherwise. But before they could return to Willow Creek, they needed proof. A single letter would not be enough. Mayor Voss was powerful. He had friends, money, influence. They needed something stronger, something that could not be ignored. That night, while the fire burned low, Margaret sat at the table with several papers spread in front of her. Caleb watched quietly. "You have a plan?" She looked up. "I think so. That usually means you definitely do." She smiled. "You are learning." Caleb shook his head. "What are you thinking?" Margaret looked at the papers. People like Mayor Voss always believe they are smarter than everyone else, usually because nobody challenges them. Exactly. She tapped the page. They talk freely around people they think do not matter. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. The bakery. Margaret nodded. For years, important men had gathered in her bakery. They spoke around her. They ignored her. They assumed she was only there to bake. But Margaret remembered. Every conversation, every name, every suspicious comment, every secret. Caleb leaned back slowly. "They gave you the information themselves." Margaret nodded, without realizing it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb smiled. Not a small, almost smile. A real one. And Margaret noticed. "You smiled?" He looked confused. "What? You actually smiled?" "I did not." "You did." Caleb looked away. Margaret laughed, and the sound filled the cabin. A sound that once would have felt impossible. Two lonely people. Two wounded people. Two people who had been told they were not enough. Now sitting together, planning how to stand against everyone who had underestimated them. Outside, the mountains remained quiet, but far away in Willow Creek, Mayor Edwin Voss believed his plan was working perfectly. He believed Margaret Holloway had disappeared. He believed Caleb Ror was isolated. He believed nobody could stop him. He had no idea that the woman he had sent away as a joke was returning with something far more powerful than revenge. The truth. The next morning, Margaret woke before the sun reached the mountain peaks. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The soft crackling of the fire, the unfamiliar wooden ceiling above her, the quiet sound of wind moving through the trees. Then she remembered. The cabin, the mountain, Caleb, and everything that had happened. She sat up slowly, listening. For most of her life, mornings had begun with responsibility. She had always been the first person awake in her bakery, preparing dough while the rest of Willow Creek slept. She knew the exact sound of every floorboard in that building, the exact amount of flour needed for each recipe, and the exact time the first customer would knock on the door. Her life had been predictable, safe, lonely. But this place was different. Here, every morning carried uncertainty. And strangely, Margaret realized she did not hate that. She stepped out of bed and walked toward the window. Outside, the snow had almost disappeared. The mountain looked different now. Less like a prison and more like a world waiting to be explored. A few moments later, she heard Caleb outside. He was already working. Of course he was. Margaret shook her head with a small smile. The man truly did not know how to rest. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. Caleb was near the barn, checking one of the horses. "You are awake early." He looked over. "So are you." "I have always been awake early." "Because of the bakery." Margaret nodded. "For years." Caleb ran a hand along the horse's neck. "You miss it?" The question surprised her. She expected herself to say yes immediately, but she paused. "I miss parts of it." "What parts?" "The smell." A faint smile crossed her face. "The first batch of bread in the morning. The sound of people walking through the door. Knowing I created something people enjoyed." Caleb nodded. "And the rest?" Margaret looked toward the mountains. "The rest, I do not miss." He understood. She did not need to explain, because he knew what it was like to love something and still be hurt by the people connected to it. "Do you think you will go back?" Caleb asked. Margaret was quiet. "I do not know." The answer surprised even her. For years, the bakery had been her entire identity. But now she wondered if she had confused being needed with being valued. Those were not the same thing. "You know," Caleb said, "you do not have to decide today." Margaret looked at him. "You are very good at giving advice for someone who avoids his own feelings." He looked slightly offended. "I do not avoid them." She raised an eyebrow. Caleb looked away. Margaret smiled. That was convincing. A quiet laugh escaped him. This time he did not try to hide it, and Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. Later that day, they began preparing for their journey back to Willow Creek. The snow had cleared enough for travel, but the mountain roads were still dangerous. Caleb packed supplies while Margaret organized the documents they had found. She carefully copied important information onto separate sheets. Caleb watched her. "You are prepared." Margaret looked up. "I have learned that people who underestimate you rarely expect you to be ready." That answer stayed with him, because it explained so much about her. She had not become strong because life was easy. She became strong because life gave her no other choice. When everything was packed, Caleb stood near the doorway. "Before we leave," Margaret turned. He looked uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than she had ever seen him. "What?" "There is something you should know." She waited. "The people in Willow Creek may not welcome you." Margaret smiled sadly. "They never did before." Caleb's expression hardened. "That is not what I mean." She looked at him. "They may try to make you feel small again." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she walked closer. "Caleb." "Yes?" "I spent most of my life letting people decide how I should see myself." She looked toward the mountains behind him. "I am not doing that anymore." Something changed in his expression. Pride. Not pity. Not concern. Pride. "You are different." Margaret smiled. "So are you." Caleb looked confused. "What does that mean?" "When I arrived here, you looked like a man who had given up." He looked away. "But you have not." A pause. "You are just waiting for a reason to care again." The words touched something deep inside him, because they were true, and because Margaret was the first person brave enough to say it. The journey down the mountain took 2 days. They traveled slowly, allowing the horses to rest and avoiding the worst parts of the trail. During the ride, Margaret noticed something she never expected. People treated Caleb differently, not because he demanded respect, because he carried himself like someone who already believed he deserved it. She wondered what that felt like, to walk through the world without constantly questioning whether you belonged. When they finally reached the edge of Willow Creek, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. The town looked exactly the same wooden buildings, the same dusty roads, the same people moving through their daily lives. But Margaret felt different. The wagon entered the town slowly. Heads turned. Whispers began. At first, nobody recognized her. Then, someone did. A woman near the market dropped the basket she was holding. "Margaret?" The word spread quickly. People stopped walking. They stared. The woman they had sent away months earlier had returned, but she was not broken. She was sitting beside Caleb Ror, and she looked completely different. Not because her appearance had changed, not because she had become someone else, because she no longer looked like someone waiting for permission to exist. Caleb climbed down from the wagon first. Then he helped Margaret down. The simple gesture made the entire street quiet, because everyone saw it. The mountain man who was supposed to reject her was standing beside her, not ashamed, not embarrassed, proud. Mayor Edwin Voss stepped out from the town hall when he heard the commotion. His expression changed the moment he saw them. For a brief second, fear appeared. Only a second. Then it disappeared behind a practiced smile. "Well, well," he said. "Look who decided to return." Margaret looked at him calmly. "Mayor Voss." He looked between her and Caleb. "I assume your little misunderstanding has been resolved." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Misunderstanding?" The mayor smiled. "Surely there is no reason to create unnecessary conflict." Margaret studied him. Years ago she would have looked away. She would have lowered her voice. She would have apologized, but not anymore. "We need to talk." The mayor laughed softly. "About what?" Margaret reached into her bag and removed the letter. The smile disappeared. Only for a moment, but Margaret saw it. She always noticed small things. "I believe you know exactly what this is." Mayor Voss looked at Caleb, then back at Margaret. "That old paper means nothing." "Perhaps," she nodded. "But it is interesting." She stepped closer. "Because it proves you knew about the land negotiations before you sent me to Caleb's ranch." The street became silent. The mayor's face changed. "You should be careful making accusations." Margaret smiled. "I am." She held up another document. "That is why I brought proof." Caleb stood beside her, not in front, beside, because this was her moment. For years, people had spoken for Margaret. Now she was speaking for herself. Mayor Voss looked around at the crowd. He saw the curiosity in their faces. He saw people beginning to question, and he hated that. Because powerful people could survive anger, they could survive arguments, but they feared questions. Questions changed things. "Where did you get those?" The mayor's voice was quieter now. Margaret looked at him. "From places you forgot to hide them." A few people nearby exchanged uncertain looks. Because they had known Margaret for years, they had thought she was only the baker. They had never imagined she was watching, listening, remembering. The mayor forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous." But Caleb stepped forward. "No." His voice was calm. And somehow that made it more serious. "This is the first honest conversation this town has had in years." The mayor stared at him. "You think you can challenge me?" Caleb looked around at the town, then at Margaret. "No." A pause. "I know we can." For the first time, Mayor Edwin Voss looked uncertain. Because the people standing before him were not the same people he had planned against. The lonely mountain cowboy, the unwanted baker, the two people everyone believed were easy to control. They had returned with something the mayor could not buy, the truth. But Margaret knew something else. Truth alone was not always enough. Powerful people did not surrender easily, and Mayor Voss was not a man who would quietly admit defeat. As the crowd slowly gathered around them, Margaret noticed someone watching from the back of the street, someone she recognized, Thomas Bell. The supply store owner, one of the men who had laughed at her. His face looked different now, not amused, afraid, and Margaret understood. The mayor was not the only person with secrets. The whole town had been built on people looking away. Now, for the first time, everyone was being forced to look. The silence that followed Margaret's words felt heavier than any argument could have been. For years, Willow Creek had been a town where people knew exactly what to say and when to say it. They knew who had influence, who had money, and who should be ignored. Margaret Holloway had always belonged to that last category. At least, that was what they believed. But now she stood in the middle of the street, holding evidence that could threaten the very people who had spent years convincing everyone else that they were untouchable. And for the first time, the people of Willow Creek were not looking through her. They were looking at her. Mayor Edwin Voss forced a smile, but Margaret could see the tension in his face. She had spent years behind the counter of her bakery watching people. She knew when someone was lying. She knew the difference between confidence and fear. And right now, Edwin Voss was afraid. "Margaret," the mayor said carefully, I think you have misunderstood what you found. She tilted her head slightly. Have I? Of course. He stepped forward, lowering his voice, as if trying to make the situation seem private. These are complicated matters, business discussions, things that can easily be taken out of context. Margaret looked around at the people watching them, the same people who once laughed when she walked down the street, the same people who watched her leave town believing she was heading toward humiliation. Now they were listening. Funny, Margaret said softly. People always say things are complicated when they do not want others to understand them. A few townspeople exchanged looks. The mayor noticed, and he did not like it. Do not turn this into some kind of performance. Margaret almost smiled, because that was exactly what he had done to her. He had turned her life into a performance, a joke, a story people could tell while drinking in the saloon. But now, the story had changed. No performance, Mayor, she replied. Just questions. Caleb stood quietly beside her. Margaret noticed that. He could have stepped forward. He could have intimidated the mayor with his reputation alone. But he did not. He understood. This was not his battle to fight for her. This was her moment. A few months earlier, Margaret would never have imagined standing in the middle of Willow Creek, challenging the most powerful man in town. She would have worried about making people uncomfortable. She would have worried about being called difficult. Now she only worried about one thing: the truth. Where did you get those papers? Mayor Voss asked. Margaret looked at him. Does it matter? It matters, because you are making serious accusations. No, she said calmly. What matters is what the papers say. The mayor's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, another voice came from the crowd. Maybe we should see them. Everyone turned. It was Thomas Bell, the supply store owner, the man who had laughed at Margaret outside her bakery. The man who had made jokes about her appearance. The same man who had looked at her as if she was nothing more than entertainment. Margaret studied him carefully. The mayor looked surprised. Thomas swallowed. I think people deserve to know. The mayor's expression darkened. For the first time, Margaret saw something unexpected. The town was not united behind Edwin Voss anymore. Fear had kept people quiet for years. But fear only worked until someone was brave enough to speak first. Margaret handed the letter to Thomas. He read it slowly. His face changed. Then he passed it to the person beside him. Within minutes, whispers moved through the crowd. What does this mean? Did the mayor really know about the railroad? Was Caleb's land always the target? Did he send Margaret there on purpose? The mayor raised his voice. Enough! The crowd became quiet. But it was different now. Before, they were quiet because they obeyed. Now they were quiet because they were thinking, and that was much more dangerous. You all know me, Edwin Voss said. You know what I have done for this town. A man near the back spoke. We know what you told us. The mayor turned. What? The man stepped forward. We do not know what you have done. The words were simple, but they changed everything. Margaret watched as the mayor realized something important. The power he had built was not made from respect. It was made from people believing he could never be challenged, and that belief was breaking. But Margaret also knew they were not finished. People like Edwin Voss did not spend years gaining control only to lose it in one afternoon. He would fight back. She could feel it. Later that evening, Margaret and Caleb returned to the small house they had rented outside town while deciding their next move. The town felt different. Not peaceful. Not yet. But awake. Margaret sat at the table, looking over the documents. Caleb leaned against the wall. You handled yourself well today. She looked up. Did I? Yes. I was terrified. Caleb's expression softened. You did not look terrified. Margaret smiled faintly. That is because I learned a long time ago that people are more comfortable when they think you are afraid. The words saddened him. Because he hated that she had needed to learn that. You should never have had to become that strong. Margaret looked at him. Maybe. A pause. But I did. Caleb nodded. And there was respect in his eyes. Not because she survived, because she became someone who could choose what happened next. That night, Margaret could not sleep. Something bothered her. The documents they had found were important, but they were not enough. Mayor Voss had spent years building his reputation. He would claim misunderstanding. He would claim innocence. He would find people willing to support him. They needed something stronger, something undeniable. She got out of bed and returned to the table. Caleb, who was sleeping lightly in the next room, noticed. "What are you doing?" Margaret looked over. Thinking. That usually means trouble. She smiled. "You are starting to understand me." Caleb walked over. "What are you thinking?" Margaret looked at the papers. "About the bakery." "The bakery?" She nodded. "Everyone talked there." Caleb understood immediately. "They thought you were invisible." "Exactly." She touched one of the documents. "People reveal themselves when they believe nobody important is listening." Caleb looked at her carefully. "You remember conversations?" Margaret nodded. "Not everything." A small smile appeared. "But enough." The next morning, they returned to the bakery. Margaret had not been inside since she left. Standing in front of the familiar wooden door brought back memories. Good ones, painful ones. The smell of flour, the old wooden counter, the small bell above the entrance. This place had been both her shelter and her prison. She stepped inside. Dust covered the shelves. The ovens were cold, but it still felt like home. Caleb stood near the doorway. "You sure about this?" Margaret nodded. "I need to know what I remember." She walked through the bakery slowly. Each corner carried a memory. The table where she prepared dough. The shelves where customers picked up their orders. The corner where she had stood quietly, while powerful men talked as if she were not there. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved toward the old storage room. "Wait." Caleb followed her gaze. "What?" Margaret walked toward a small wooden cabinet. "I remember something." She opened the cabinet. Inside were old notebooks. Her personal recipe books, but beneath them was something else, a small leather journal. Caleb looked curious. "What is that?" Margaret picked it up. "I do not know." She opened the cover. The first pages were empty. Then she reached the middle and froze. Caleb noticed immediately. "Margaret?" She looked up slowly. Her face had changed. "What is it?" She turned the journal toward him. Inside were notes, names, dates, payments, conversations. Someone had been recording information about Mayor Voss for years, and the handwriting was not hers. Caleb frowned. "Who wrote this?" Margaret looked at the final page. There was a name neither of them expected. Her voice became quiet. "My father." The room went completely still, because Margaret's father had been gone for more than a decade, and somehow, hidden inside her old bakery, he had left behind the one thing that could finally expose Edwin Voss, the truth. But there was one question neither of them could answer. Why had Margaret's father been collecting evidence? And why had he hidden it where only Margaret would eventually find it? Outside the bakery, footsteps stopped near the door. Someone was watching. Someone who knew they had found something. And whoever it was did not want Margaret Holloway uncovering the past. Margaret stared at the journal in her hands, unable to move. The small leather book felt heavier than it should have, not because of its size, because of what it meant. Her father had always been a quiet man, a person who believed actions mattered more than words. She remembered him as someone who repaired broken tools instead of replacing them, someone who helped neighbors without expecting anything in return, someone who always told her that kindness was not weakness. But she had never known he was keeping records. She had never known he was watching Mayor Edwin Voss. "Your father knew," Caleb said quietly. Margaret looked up. "Knew what?" That something was wrong. She lowered her eyes back to the journal. The pages were filled with careful handwriting. Dates, names, amounts of money. Conversations. Her father had written down things he had overheard while delivering supplies around town. Things that seemed small at the time, but together created a picture of something much larger. Mayor Voss had been moving money, hiding deals, making promises he had no right to make. And Margaret's father had noticed. "He tried to stop him," she whispered. Caleb stepped closer. "Maybe he did." She looked at him. What do you mean? Caleb pointed toward the back of the journal. There is a date here. Margaret turned the page. The date was only a few weeks before her father died. Below it was a single sentence. I have placed the truth where my daughter will find it when she is ready. Margaret froze. Her hand covered her mouth. For years, she had wondered why her father had spent so much time in the bakery storage room before his death. She thought he was organizing supplies. She thought he was preparing the business for her. But he had been preparing something else. He had been preparing her. He knew I would find this. Caleb nodded slowly. He believed you would. Margaret felt tears forming. Not because she was sad, because she finally understood something. Her father had never seen her the way Willow Creek saw her. He had never seen a woman who was too large, too quiet, or too different. He had seen his daughter, a person capable of carrying the truth, a person strong enough to do what was right.
He believed in me,
she whispered. Caleb looked at her. Of course he did. Margaret looked away. Nobody else ever did. Caleb's expression softened. I do. The words were quiet, but they reached somewhere deep inside her. Before Margaret could answer, a sound came from outside. A footstep, then another. Caleb immediately turned. The change in him was instant. The gentle man who had been standing beside her disappeared. The mountain cowboy returned. Alert, focused, protective. He moved toward the door. Stay behind me. Margaret looked at him. Caleb, Margaret. She understood his tone. Not fear, concern. She slowly nodded. Caleb opened the door. Nobody was there. Only the empty street. But something sat on the ground near the entrance. A folded piece of paper. Caleb picked it up. Margaret watched his expression change as he read it. What does it say? He handed it to her. The message was short, simple. Stop digging. Margaret stared at the words. For a moment, fear tried to return. The old fear. The fear of being laughed at. The fear of being punished for speaking. But then she remembered something. She was not the same woman who had left Willow Creek months earlier. That woman had hoped someone would choose her. This woman had learned she could choose herself. They are scared, she said. Caleb looked at her. What? Margaret folded the note. They are scared. He studied her. How do you know? Because people who are confident do not threaten people in secret. A small smile appeared on Caleb's face. You really do notice everything. Margaret looked toward the street. People thought I was invisible. She held the note tightly. They never realized invisible people see everything. The next few days became a quiet battle, not with weapons, not with violence, with information. Margaret and Caleb carefully organized everything they had found. The journal, the letters, the documents. Every piece connected another part of the story. Mayor Voss had not only planned to take Caleb's land, he had been stealing from Willow Creek for years. The railroad opportunity had simply given him a reason to move faster. He had created fear. He had created confusion, and he had used people as pieces in his game, including Margaret. But Margaret also discovered something else. Someone had been helping him. Someone close. Someone nobody would suspect. Caleb placed a document on the table. Look at this name. Margaret read it. Her face changed. Thomas Bell? The supply store owner. The same man who had mocked her. The same man who had recently spoken against the mayor. I don't understand. Caleb leaned back. Maybe he was involved. Margaret shook her head. No. How can you know? She looked at the paper. Because when he spoke yesterday, he looked ashamed. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You trust him? No, she paused. But I understand him. That surprised Caleb. Margaret continued. People sometimes follow cruel people because they are afraid. That does not excuse it. She looked at him. But it explains it. Caleb nodded. That was one of the things he admired most about her. She could see someone's mistakes without losing sight of their humanity. The next morning, Margaret went to see Thomas. The supply store was quiet. When he saw her enter, his expression changed. Margaret? She looked around. You were helping him. Thomas looked down. I know what it looks like. Then tell me what it is. A long silence followed. Finally, he sighed. I made mistakes. Margaret waited. Thomas leaned against the counter. Voss promised me a better position if the railroad deal went through. He said everyone would benefit. And you believed him? Thomas looked ashamed. At first, Margaret said nothing. Then I started seeing things. What things? People losing money. Town accounts not matching. Men being pressured into selling property. He looked at her. And then he sent you away. Margaret's expression hardened. Thomas lowered his head. That was when I realized what kind of man he was. For years, Margaret had wanted people like Thomas to admit what they had done. She had imagined feeling satisfaction. But standing there, she only felt tired, because cruelty damaged everyone, even the people who participated in it. Will you help us? She asked. Thomas looked surprised. After everything? Margaret nodded. Yes? Why? She thought about it, then answered honestly. Because I spent years wishing someone would give me a chance to be better than what they thought I was. Thomas looked away. A quiet shame crossed his face. I do not deserve that. Maybe not. Margaret's voice was gentle. But someone has to start somewhere. The final confrontation came 1 week later. The town gathered in the courthouse, not because they wanted drama, because they wanted answers. Mayor Voss stood at the front, dressed perfectly, still trying to appear like the powerful man he had always been. But Margaret noticed something. His hands were shaking, just slightly. Nobody else saw. She did. Caleb stood beside her. The judge looked over the gathered documents. This is a serious matter, Mayor Voss laughed. This is nothing more than a personal attack from people angry about a business disagreement. Margaret stepped forward. The room became quiet. No, her voice was calm. This is about years of people being ignored. She opened the journal. My father recorded what he saw, because he believed the truth mattered. Mayor Voss rolled his eyes. Your father was a simple man. Margaret looked directly at him, and yet he saw what you were doing. The room went silent. She continued. You thought people like my father did not matter. You thought people like me did not matter. She looked around. You were wrong. One by one, the evidence was presented. The stolen funds, the false agreements, the plans involving Caleb's land, the letters proving the deception. By the end, there was nothing left for Mayor Voss to deny. The man who had spent years controlling the town finally had no control left. The judge delivered the decision. Mayor Edwin Voss would answer for his crimes. The room remained silent as he was escorted away. Margaret watched him leave. She expected to feel victorious. Instead, she felt something else. Peace. Because she was not fighting to become important. She had always been important. She was simply done letting others convince her otherwise. Months later, Willow Creek was different. Not perfect. No town ever was, but different. People began treating Margaret differently, not because they suddenly became kinder, because they finally understood. The woman they had ignored had been the person who saved them. The bakery reopened, but Margaret changed the sign above the door. It no longer said only Holloway Bakery. It said Holloway and Ror. Caleb noticed the first morning. You added my name. Margaret smiled. You are part of my life. He looked at the sign. Then at her. I like it. She smiled. I know. Caleb laughed. A real laugh. The kind Margaret had learned to love. Years later, people would still tell the story of the strange marriage request that brought Margaret Holloway to the mountains. They would talk about the lonely cowboy, the quiet baker, the cruel joke that became something beautiful. But Margaret always remembered the most important part. She had not found her worth in Caleb. She had not found it in proving the town wrong. She had carried it with her the entire time. Caleb had simply been the first person who looked closely enough to see it. And in the end, the woman Willow Creek tried to send away as a humiliation became the woman who reminded an entire town of something they had forgotten. A person's value was never decided by the eyes of people who refused to see them. It was always there, waiting to be recognized.